Hey there, friends. Dr. David Hall with Church Psychology. Today, Matt and I get into a conversation about social media and mental health. It will certainly not be the last conversation we have about that, as it's a major area of teaching and research for me. But today, we're going to particularly unpack the American Psychological Association's advisory that they give, health advisory for youth and their mental health, well-being, and development as it relates to interactions with social media. That's going to be part of the conversation today. Hope it's something you can get a lot out of. Now we're going to drop into that intro music.
Welcome to Church Psychology, a podcast of the Negev Institute. We are mental health professionals looking at the intersections of social and behavioral science in the Christian life. Please connect with our free resources in our open community library at churchpsychology.org. We would be grateful if you would follow, like, or subscribe to Church Psychology wherever you are finding us, and also leave us a review. As we start, if we are to love the Lord our God with all of our mind, it makes sense to work on our headspace. So let's get to work. Well, welcome everybody to the Church Psychology Podcast. My name is Matt Schoeneman. I'm here with Dr. David Hall. Hey, David.
Hey, Matt. As always, great to see your smiling face.
I know. Through the screen as it is.
We're talking about, we'd like to start recording in the same room. And it's funny, we're in the same building as we record this. We're just a floor apart.
We can't stand each other though, so this is why.
Well,
there has to be distance.
There has to be. We're working there. It's part of the. We're working on that part of our relationship. And but we're coming off of recording this right after a long weekend.
Yeah,
and
feeling fresh. Are you feeling fresh?
Ish. You kind of talked about, but well, it's funny.
I'm not. I just go ahead and say, like, long weekends make short weeks tough.
Yeah.
Let's do a whole conversation on the fact that holidays are good in the moment, but it makes everything else hard.
We could do a whole thing on how Americans do holidays and how well do we really rest as a culture.
Well,
and that could be its own thing. But
spoiler alert, not well.
Yeah. But you had some travel and you've got young kids. And as one of our mutual friends says, I think about a lot, that when you have young children, you don't go on vacation, you go on trips.
You go on trips. Exactly. Vacation happens prior to children and then after they leave.
So you've been told. Or every once in a while when you have an outing. Well,
that's why I'm holding on to is hope. Yeah. No.
Relating to kids. Yeah.
Kids and speaking to each other through devices. We are coming to you trying to talk about a subject that is present with everybody, but maybe not discussed in the way that we're going to bring it today. And so that topic is on social media and its impact on mental health. This is something, David, that you know that I've been passionate about, at least in the sense of trying to understand it and what's happening. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I would call myself rebellious or kind of I don't know the other word I'm looking for, but there has been a sense of being skeptical of social media, at least for the past few years on myself. And as I've done my own personal audits of my use of social media, that's come out more and more, my skepticism, my question marks, my concern. And so I will probably carry a flare of one side of this, but I'm going to try really hard with you, David, to stay centered, because that's the way in our conversation and with others listening to this, I don't want to come across as a place of like, now here, the next 30 minutes, you're going to hear the reasons why you should burn it to the ground, nor on the other end, maybe is to say like, here is why it's the best thing since sliced bread. I don't know. So
sliced bread's pretty awesome.
Yeah. But anyway, so that to tease it is to say, we want to bring more of a balanced approach. But
I think we want, for those who are checking out this podcast, other resources we have with the Negev Institute, we want people to feel that if we do every once in a while, we probably will say, "Yeah, you gotta burn this to the ground." But we wanna be selective in that,
Yeah.
so whenever we
Yeah.
do say that, that it feels important.
Yeah.
And but realizing that so many things are held in tension. You know,
Yeah.
we joke a lot about the classic therapist answer of when asked a yes or no question, our answer is often, "Well, it depends,"
Mm.
because it often does.
Yeah.
Life is layered and complex, and if you want it to be otherwise, then find another planet. It may work differently somewhere else. As far as we know, our
Yeah.
experience on this plane of existence, as there's a lot of layers to
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
But
Well, and some of this stuff, is relevant. And again, these are things probably that the majority hasn't like seen. But there's been some things released, David, recently from whether it's the APA or even the Surgeon General cautioning some of the aspects of social media as it relates to especially younger people and
Mhm.
teenagers, adolescents.
Yeah,
And so that's somewhat what has spurred, I think, our thoughts towards this to say, you know what, let's bring the conversation to the table. And social media is such a broad conversation topic that we're not going to cover everything in this podcast episode. Um, but maybe to launch us into the conversation together, what was released by the APA in, I
May.
don't know when we're recording this, it's after May, but this was so in May,
In May
they
2023,
released,
yeah.
yeah,
And to give some context to this too, so Matt and I were talking beforehand of, as we are still in fairly early parts of the series of this podcast, of we don't we generally wanna shy away from taking hot takes on things. I think there's a lot of podcasting, a lot of just things in the social media space that becomes about that. And
yeah,
for one, that there are some issues with that. Some, it creates this expectation that as soon as you start doing that, then there's the expectation as soon as there's anything in the ether that's being talked about a lot, you gotta have a take on it.
yeah,
And that's kinda confining, and there's a lot of pressure to that, so we didn't wanna do that. The other bit is it becomes we don't want people sitting around waiting to be like, "Oh, well, what are, the church psychology nerds gonna say about this topic before I form an opinion, before I like," because we want to be aids and encouragement in your own journeys and discernment and
yeah,
gaining knowledge, and if we can help in that, awesome. But so in general, we're not going to do hot takes. However, as Matt alluded to, so the APA is the American Psychological Association, for those who are uh, were wondering.
yeah,
It's the main professional body for licensed psychologists in the United States, and like the American Medical Association, some other groups, occasionally they'll put out advisories, health advisories related to issues pertaining to mental health. And in May
right,
2023, they put out an advisory on social media and adolescence, and basically setting guidelines for how particularly parents, it's geared towards other groups, but mostly parents should consider access and degrees of social media use for early adolescence, what they're defining as 10 to 14 years old.
yeah,
And this is a big deal.
yeah, yeah,
This is the first time that they've released the APA has released anything like this. And I've Matt and I have had some time to kind of go through their guidance. There are things that we agree with. There are things that I think maybe, I wouldn't say disagree, like, but I think they have different emphasis on different points
yeah.
of
That's a good way to put it.
yeah, it's the I mean, there is no guidance on kind of the preteen, on the 10 and younger in this, but that's not the point of this advisory. They make some recommendations for later teenagers that I wouldn't necessarily wholeheartedly introduce, just more of they talk about, um, a concepts of increasing teenage privacy, which I do agree with in principle. I think
Yeah,
some of the implications of their advisory means that they push to even less interaction or monitoring for later adolescence, which I don't know if I agree with.
yeah,
They often, though, bring up points of just further research of and which I do appreciate the honesty in that of saying like, "Hey, this is based on some early findings. There's still a lot more for us to do." So,
So,
yeah,
so
that's what we're
real,
gonna talk
real,
about today.
real quick, with that, I think it'd be helpful to understand. So, time frame for this. I don't have as much information, and I don't want to go too far down a tangent on this, but the reason why we don't have a lot of findings, and maybe you could speak a little bit to why empirical data is hard to grab so quickly. But the reality of social media is its exponential curve. It started in 2007 ish, or at least the blow up of it. There were iterations of this, whether it's MySpace or other things, before Facebook kind of really launched.
Mhm.
But it was around 2007 that the Facebook really kind of took off, and in its heyday, it was fairly, I don't know how you would call it, subdued, because it was really just attached to college campuses
I
and
used to enjoy
college
it.
students. Yeah, I did too. It started becoming to the more public sphere and then got onto iPhones a couple years later, and that's when it really took off. So we're looking at like the late 2000s, early 2010s when it really took shape, and we're only in 2023. Well, when we're
Yeah,
recording
it's
this.
to kind of the question of why, what are we still discovering? First off, it's um, psychology is a tricky thing to do really in-depth research in because there aren't pharmaceutical companies funding it. If I mean, and
That's
that's just
fair. It's fair.
that's fair. The
Yeah.
reality of it. So, unless the end result of research is a patentable drug in healthcare, it's hard to fund.
Yeah.
And so a lot of this gets stuff that's cobbled together by psychology departments, individual graduate students. And so that's just the nature of that versus so many other things. So that's one thing. The other bit is you're highlighting on we've only lived with some of this stuff for so long. So for um the internet went public with access to because the internet started to exist in the 80s of the interconnectedness with computers. For public access in it began to happen in 1995. So we are looking at about 30 years, a little less than 30 years, and that's kind of the first iteration.
Yeah.
And then it took several years for it to really build momentum. It was in the late 90s, early 2000s that you ended up with the dot-com boom, where people began doing business sorts of things online a lot more, the growth of chat rooms and things, and certain people may be listening to that like, "Oh, I remember chat rooms," and then what you're talking about is the rise of social media as we understand it, which was really in the mid 2000 zeros, the
Yeah.
oddies, as the
Mhm.
kids call it. The
Is that what they call it? I didn't know
I think
that.
so, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
But with Facebook, there were early iterations of MySpace. You may have had, if you were really cutting edge, you may have had a Zanga site early on, but then it was
You
Facebook.
lost all our population from that. I was like,
No, so
"What?"
the younger Gen Xers, older millennials will know where I am in this. But you're right. So one of the big things that happened was in the late 2000s, it's Facebook opened up to the wider public outside of exclusively college students. You began uh, the smartphone, uh, iPhone. I believe it was in 2007 that the first
Yeah.
generation of the iPhone came out,
Yeah.
and kind of going to that, and then people like the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt really focus on things that happened in 2011. Big things happened in 2011 that affect the social dynamics of social media. One was Facebook introduced the like button,
Yep.
and Twitter introduced the retweet, and that really kind of created aspects of what became viral things
Yeah.
in social media. And it continues to evolve. But to your point, very belaboredly, it's mostly shifting.
Yeah.
And so how much to do research on something like TikTok? That kind of is very much a thing right now, but it's only been fairly recently.
Yeah.
And where it will go it was fairly recently that the state of Montana passed a
Yeah.
ban on it. And so
And
someone might
many
listen to
college campuses are closing
yeah,
down on it too.
yeah. And so in a year or two, TikTok may be a thing, or it may be everything.
Mm.
And so it
Well,
becomes harder to test some of these things because even the parameters of what we mean by social media and what people are doing on it changes.
yeah. And I think part of that too is that because it's ever changing, we haven't, I think, until recently seen that, oh, something could be amiss here. Or at least there's question marks of what what level of impact does this have on people? And so until we can recognize a problem, do we then researching what the elements of the problem are? And so you look at the timeline, we haven't had many years to actually consider that maybe some of these things are a problem. I was
Mhm.
actually looking back in I think it was 2021. So APA releases their health advisory in 2023. And I don't think anybody really caught this, but in 2021 was when the Surgeon General released a huge report
Mm.
of some of the advisories as it relates to social media use. And
Mm.
that's right on the heels of COVID. And so we're just now looking at it as, hey, maybe this isn't the most brilliant thing ever. There's good aspects of it, but we've been kind of going at it unrestricted for many years. And
Yeah,
so that's
and
becoming
or
problematic.
struggling with figuring out how or why or what are the reasons to restrict, and so,
Mm.
yeah, let's get into that, and
Yeah.
to give some context, like, I started, teaching a course on social media in 2011. So it's funny, it's gone through different
Wow.
iterations,
Yeah.
and, because social media has changed and how we interact with it and where we're exposed to it, and, as Matt was saying too, there are good and bads. This isn't a one side, and let's start with the positive. It's a shorter
Sure.
list in some ways, but, like, there is so, as you're talking about the context of COVID,
Yeah.
for many of us, that was how we interacted with people so much, particularly in the early days of the pandemic.
Mm.
And, Matt and I we experienced that it allowed us to sustain in our livelihoods as mental health counselors, that there was the technology available for us to start meeting with people virtually.
Yeah.
If the pandemic had happened 10, 15 years before, that would have been a very different thing to navigate. And
Yeah.
I'm very grateful in that sense for that. And, there is research has shown that people, particularly individuals that would otherwise feel fairly isolated, have the ability to connect over distance and even just the process of finding people with other like-minded people.
Yeah.
The rise of, what's often called kinda nerd culture has been very much fueled by this because, you might find that you have this really niche interest in something,
Mhm.
and it's not something any of your in-person community resonates with quite in the same way, but the internet allows you to find other people that are also geek out about this thing.
Yeah.
And I've experienced that to a certain degree, like, I'm involved in certain hobbies and niches, and I really appreciate being able to find resources and individuals that can speak into this in ways that I I got into one of the things that happened to me in COVID, and this shows a bit of my age, I got really into my lawn and grass because I spent a lot of time out walking around, and so I started finding, like, Facebook groups on, like, lawn maintenance sorts of
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
I only got so involved, but I was able to connect with people, and
Yeah.
and if you're somebody and this is important, I can say for friends of mine that have worked as missionaries, internet spaces and the ability to socialize in them
Mm.
have, particularly in places of the persecuted church,
Yeah.
gives them access to encouragement, to
Yeah.
connect with one another in ways that would be very difficult to do out in the open.
Yeah. That's a good point. Mhm. Yeah.
That's some of the positive.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree with those. My mind actually went to more of the devil's advocate as you talk about these niche places. And I was like, yeah, but that also could be really niche places that are bad, like that you can't,
Yes.
that are not good for you. And that's also happened. And so I think it's the creativeness and oddity of social media is how well it polarizes
Mhm.
and some for good, but also for bad.
Church Psychology is a production of the Negev Institute, a research, resource, and teaching initiative that aims to provide Christian communities with practical education and consulting to faithfully speak to our needs in mental health, relational science, and human habit and behavior. A great way to support Negev is to start a free membership in our open community library at churchpsychology.org, and then stay connected with our email newsletter to hear about new classes, publications, live forums, and in-person events. Again, you can find all that at churchpsychology.org. So, to get into some of the guidelines,
Yeah.
I want to look at two areas of the guidelines that I think feel most relevant to unpack, and they're most like because it was social media bad, you know,
Mhm.
well, like a lot of things, it depends.
Yeah.
There are lots of things in our space of we talk about like, is it exposing there's kind of the obvious sort of problems. Like, is it creating issues with people being exposed to material that is overtly problematic? People will talk about hate speech, pornography,
Yeah.
um, self-harm, eating
Mm,
disorder. Like there's a lot, and it's amazing how much is on social media
mm,
that targets and encourages a lot of these behaviors. And different platforms will the nature of how social media works. There are lots of different ways that the algorithms of different social media platforms
mhm.
work. But here's the basic principle that any parent or someone who's giving guidance to parents or to teenagers should consider is the goal of any social media platform is to keep you interacting with the platform. And so part of how it feeds you information is if it can feed you information that encourages you to continue to engage, that's what it does. Its
Yeah.
number one goal is to keep you engaged with it. And there's certain emotions that if triggered in people, some of it is a sense of like joy. Like I get a lot of puppy videos and cat videos in my social media feed. And most of us do will things like that because it's stuff will, and that will trigger more positive emotions. But anxiety will also do it.
Mm,
And it um if you're getting exposed to content that encourages anxiety in you and distress, oftentimes that will keep you engaged in it as a desire, or because you're trying to scratch that itch, you're trying to satiate that feeling of anxiety. And so oftentimes you'll keep on engaging in the material. Those sorts of things I've talked about feel more obvious, but there's a secondary level too that sometimes people miss. And this was specifically in the guidelines, and this is in comparison sorts of things. Body image comparison ones are very like, and so there's more overt material that encourages things like disordered eating,
yeah.
but they're more subversive sorts of ways. And I think this is particularly important for parents of young girls.
Yeah.
Though boys are also affected by this, but
Yes.
in talking about, you know, beauty blogging or beauty social media channels or stuff that is overly focused on appearance.
Mm,
This could be your level of physical attractiveness. Another aspect of too is stuff that focuses on wealth.
mm.
There's a lot of, I think, particularly for young men, sometimes there could be the target of this of here's my Lamborghini, and here's oftentimes it's somebody trying to sell you something like in
Yeah.
a Tony Robbins buy
Yeah.
my product sort of thing. But it's funny, scripture talks a lot about immodesty. And it's funny, we've talked about culturally immodesty being a lot to do with how much skin is showing in your outfit. But if you look throughout scripture, most of the time when immodesty is talked about, it has to do with displays of wealth
Mm,
and the how that creates envy,
mm.
which is an issue that gets brought up and addressed in the Ten Commandments.
It's
But
one of
basically,
them.
it's one of
That's
them.
one. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There are nine others. But you look at body image, comparison of wealth, comparison, what are the sorts of things that by engaging in seeing these other people causes me to feel worse about me
Yeah.
or my experience, how I experience my physical appearance, how I experience my level of physical fitness, the
Yeah.
material access I have in my life.
Yeah.
And I think the reason that's an important thing to highlight is because sometimes those can feel a bit more benign for parents. Like, oh, my daughter's really into these beauty TikToks. And, they see some positive, she's learning how to do makeup and she's being creative and all. And, the advisory from the APA isn't saying you need to eliminate that altogether, but be very mindful of how much comes in there.
I would even add to that, like, what level of conversation are you having about what's because the opposite of comparison is contentment. And so if there's a lack of contentment
Mhm.
in how they view themselves or even their process of growth, because developmentally, you are not at the place of kind of who you are physically until later past adolescence.
Early
And s-
adolescence, particularly, I grew very unevenly, and I think a lot of it did. Like, I had a lot of ears, when I was 13 or so, and,
yeah. Well, I
uh
mean, so, but the image factors, I actually had a client once that a young man, teenager, who had a lot of issues with his own image based on the effect of Instagram on him. Um, and this is not, we consider body image concerns so much more with girls, but I think all the more recently it's been boys as well. I can't remember the term, but there's a athletic type of body that boys is like, and men, young men too, are especially drawn to want to be and emulate.
Hmm.
And so there's it's the six pack abs, it's the fitness, like it's just that fit look that, you see all these guys on Instagram or TikTok revealing their fitness regimen and all that stuff. So they get caught up in this body image thing that looks like health from the outside,
yes.
but
And I
becomes
think,
much
yeah,
more a problematic potential, at least disordered eating, if not a eating disorder, uh,
there's that, but
like
it
deeper down.
yeah, it also just it fosters this deep discontentment.
Yeah.
I'm
It's
pleased
at
with
a base level, you're still dealing with discontentment. And if
mhm.
you live majority of your life in that space, that creates a lot of other
No, you bring up an important
concerns.
point in this, Matt, of in the developmental journey of realizing that, the advisory is looking specifically from the APA at ages 10 to 14, and how much physically changes in a person's body in that time frame.
Mm,
And most things, like if you go onto the construction site of a house, it
yeah.
doesn't look great. And I think the same happens in the developing body of a young adolescent of just
Yeah.
like there are a lot of
Yeah.
things that are hard in that, and
Mhm.
it feeling in this body um dysmorphia is the psychological term
Yeah.
for it.
That's it.
So it's the comparison aspect of things is a big part of it. So as parents to be thinking about, like, it may not be overtly problematic or toxic, but but what is it fostering?
Mhm.
So that's the first thing of looking at comparison sorts of issues and content. The third or the second thing I want to highlight is, and this is in the advisory, of looking at the concept of problematic social media use. That's in quotation. Problematic social media use. Looking at, and they reference a few different studies that looks at being manifest in 5 different ways. It is spending excessive effort to ensure continuous access to social media. I'm never disconnecting. I'm feeling a lot of anxiety if I'm disconnected. A strong craving to use social media or disruptions in other activities if they from missing social media,
Yeah.
it happens too much. That could be sleep interruptions, eating interruptions. That's big factors in that. Repeatedly spending more time on social media than intended. I'm going to get on for just 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then a lot more time.
I have a comment on that whenever we have a second.
Sure. So we'll do it now.
Okay. One of the most recent iterations of social media that causes that very issue are the new. Well, it's basically what TikTok is this constant feed of reels. And so Instagram, Facebook have implemented, and YouTube have implemented reels, which are short 10 to 20-second clips of something
Get that dopamine hit.
that
Yeah.
like go and you just flip through. And I can't remember the exact term, but there's like,
Terms infinity scroll for what it is.
well, that is exactly, but what happens to the person when they engage it and they think they're only doing it for 5 minutes, they look up, it's 30 minutes gone
Yeah,
by.
there's a time disruption that happens, our sense of it. I mean, there's so much in our internal clock that gets
And
poorly.
with all these things, like, so even related to the negative emotions that are experienced that get you hooked in, I think there's research that even says that um, it's negative emotions that lock someone in more than positive ones.
Sure.
And so why then do we have all these echo chambers and anxiety driven things from different, not just young adults or adolescents, but kind of the broad variety of ages that use it. Those that are most connected to social media or most hooked, I think, are hooked by a lot of the negative emotion type um, content that keeps getting given to that person. The reels and their dopamine hit, like you suggested, all of these are not just by happenstance.
Mhm.
I want that to be, clear, is that there's a lot of psychological research that goes into developing these platforms
Yeah, it's sticky
to
by design. Yeah.
yeah, sticky by design for what has been termed as attention retention. Like if
Mhm,
I can get them connected, because that's how the companies make their earnings is
mhm.
by your use of them. And so I just want to kind of bring that to the clarity of like some of these things are there because I think the APA is seeing even that there's a level to which these aren't just accidental stuff. We want to make sure you're aware that like
Mhm.
if left unattended or at least not even looked at, you could get really kind of lost into the I don't know the rabbit hole, as it were.
Yeah. All of and that's not limited just to young adolescents, but it's particularly susceptible to that because the
And I think
amount of yeah, the, so that was number 3. Number 4, it's lying or deceptive behavior to retain access to social media use.
yeah,
The kid saying, like, "How long you been on?" "Oh, it's only been 2 minutes, only been 3 minutes," or "I
yeah,
finished my homework," or "Take your pick."
yeah, yeah,
And the 5th one, loss or disruption of significant relationships or educational opportunities because of social media use.
yeah,
So to go through the 5 again, spending excessive amount of time and energy on it, strong craving for it, and it disrupts other activity, repeatedly spending more time than you planned, lying or deceptive behavior, and its negative effect on relationships, the disruption on
yeah,
relationships and
yeah,
educational opportunities. And there's a developmental aspect of this too that I think is really significant for the young adolescents of how because here's how
mhm,
I think of as an adult. I mean, my access to social media as it is today
yeah,
only came to me in my 20s and late 20s and
yeah,
30s.
yeah,
And uh, developmentally, my brain was done cooking at that point.
mhm,
And there's still like there are lots of things in this that resonate with me. I think particularly kind of the sense of losing time, of getting on and thinking I'm going to spend a certain amount of time and then it and it is uh what's difficult in this, and this is something that I teach a lot in spaces that I try to carry the conversation with social media into is the challenge for parents is in this list of things. I know so many parents that will hear this and be like, yes, this is my child.
yeah,
But then the struggle becomes, well, what do I do with it?
right,
Because there's a paradigm that we live in culturally that I think really feeds into this more than just the technology itself. Is there's a paradigm of um, anything distressing is wrong, is morally problematic.
mm,
If I do something or withhold something from my children in ways that makes them upset or is stressful to them, I'm doing damage. I'm harming them. And so this is the hard sort of place because there's also this tension of no one wants to be that parent. I hear parents say that all the time. "Oh, I don't wanna be that parent," or "I'm not that parent."
yeah,
And by that parent, they often mean the person that's overly restrictive.
right,
Man, this is a hard balance.
yeah. It is, and I think that the point of all this too, and maybe we get into some
Mhm.
now what like I think
Yeah.
a lot of people see some of the issues. Maybe this clarifies some of the issues. Maybe it's even the first time you've heard of them, but up to what next and or what do we do about it is I think that if anything, my hope would be well, let me lay my cards on the table. Just to tell you a little bit about myself. I am as of this recording 39. It was about 2 years ago, or maybe about a year and a half ago, that I made the decision after a long time using social media to cut it out of my life.
Mm,
I had found out that, or I had come to the realization that the things that I thought I could deal with, I couldn't.
Mm.
And it was making my ability to function outside of that realm difficult. And maybe at another point, I can go more into that story. The reason I bring that up, though, is one, to let people know, like, I do come from somewhat of a biased opinion. Um, Now, in our family, my wife still holds social media, partly because of her job. And for some reason, it is good that we have a balance to where I learn to live without it. She learns to live with it. And then for our children, we can use that combined knowledge and bring it to them. And so at some point, at some level, at least, I don't want her to remove herself from it. Although at times she's like, I'm out, but I bring that to you for that reason, to just share kind of honestly where I am as I speak to it. But secondly, I think my brain is fully developed. At times I question it. At, at times David questions it.
It's
But
fully developed. It may not be fully sanctified,
it's
but
definitely not that. Um,
but neither is
but
mine.
so let's say it was at 37 that I made the decision to cut it out. At 37, I'm struggling with it. And
Mm,
I have a fully developed brain. I've lived a lot of life. I've lived through some grief. I think I've matured a ton. Um, Yet I was still battling some of these aspects that we've talked about. Now, take that struggle and put it on a 16-year-old kid who doesn't have the life experience, the matured brain, the developmental process, all these aspects, the knowledge, the awareness, and try to expect them to deal with it on their own. I think it's impossible. And so where I want parents or helpers of children, whether it's counselors, teachers, youth workers, is just to recognize that they're going to need guidance on this. And I'm so grateful that major organizations such as the Surgeon General or the APA have started to speak into it. Because if I can't do it at 37, a 17-year-old can as well. And
mm,
so that's part of the reason why we bring this. And so maybe that leads us into somewhat, David, of how do we recommend to leaders of children,
mhm.
of teenagers, what are ways that they can help their adolescents learn to navigate this space? Is it restriction? Is it guidance? And so where should we go with that?
Yes is the answer
Yes, is
to
the answer
to
to
the
all.
list of things. Well, some contextual stuff, and
Yes.
appreciate you sharing as you did, Matt, because it is, as Matt and I come into these conversations as professionals in mental health, we're also still humans who carry our own stories with us,
Very
and
human.
yeah,
Yes,
in this, and so this is not something we're removed from completely. And
exactly.
I'll share it kind of a little bit for me. Like, I'm still on social media. I'm not on as many things as some of my peers are. I'm not on Twitter, for example. I'm not on, but even the things I am on, I try to keep it qualified. And one of the things I started doing the other year is I take a 6-week fast at the end of spring, beginning of summer.
Mm.
I do it from Memorial Day to 4th of July. It's 2 holiday bookends to it. So it's at the end of spring, beginning of summer. I call it sunlight over blue light. And I do that partly because it's usually, at least where we live, April's still a fairly rainy month. Like,
Yeah.
weather can be all over the place. It's really May and late May that, it's the warm, clear weather is really here,
Mhm.
and it's an opportunity to break out of some of my more lethargic rhythms of winter
Mm.
and just have one less thing. I mean, and it's really arbitrary of picking of when to take a break, but I really recommend people thinking about that. And if you think to yourself, "I don't think I could give up my social media for 6 weeks," then not to put too fine a point on it, but you may have a problem
Mm.
for anything in a person's life.
Or at least to assess whether you do have one.
Yeah, yeah, to say, if there's anything in your life beyond, like, a a core biological functioning of food, sleep, things like that, or a scriptural commendation, or something that we're commanded to in scripture.
Yeah.
of not neglecting the fellowship, of kind of, of things like that. Outside of those sorts of things, I think it's important to look at anything in your life and to say, could I give this up for any amount of time?
Mm.
I know a lot of people that, uh, they drink alcohol and that's part of their, and they feel, uh, they're believers that feel that it's appropriate and it's appropriate for them. But for many of them too, they'll take extended fasts from that. And I
Yeah.
think that's important because if you have anything in your life that you'd be like, I could give this up whenever I want. I just don't
Yeah.
want to.
Yeah.
That says something. And so it goes to the third point for the APA's guidelines, and I think this is the one to unpack the most. And it's also one of the things that I think they miss the mark a little bit on. Uh, but they talk about the idea of um, education and literacy, of social media literacy, of how to help inform these emerging young adults on just awareness of what's happening, what's going on with them. And let me clarify. I think encouraging social media literacy for parents and of teenagers and young kids is hugely important. I don't
Right.
question the APA's recommendation on that. I question its expectations of what it's going to achieve. And
Yeah.
here's why. Here's some contextual information. This is where I find a lot of parents struggle, is they'll set a boundary with their teenager, but they won't monitor the adherence to the boundary. And when, as my role as a therapist, if I bring that up, they'll say, well, the two things that they'll say that I think are hugely problematic. One is, well, they know what my expectation is, and so they'll
Mhm.
they'll follow it. And the other is, oh, he or she is a good kid. Is they don't do, and I find that hugely problematic. And let me tell you why. I'll start with the second. It's this equating that, like, if your kid struggles with this, therefore they are bad. That's not necessarily the heart behind what the parents say,
Right.
or meaning in that,
Yeah.
but that's what its
Yeah.
implication is.
Yeah. That's
It
fair.
re it really discourages honesty from the teenager side, because
Mhm.
they find that if they are struggling, if they are kind of bending these rules, if they are sneaking their iPhone to their bedroom at night and staying up late, if they are kind of all these things, that is that puts this pressure on them, and it compounds the shame that they may feel. And do you know what really helps shame feel better? Dopamine. You know what's a great way to get dopamine hits? That infinity scroll you're going through
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
whatever app you are. So that can create a really vicious cycle. But the first statement is like, well, I've told them once. It misidentifies how education works for all humans.
Mhm. Mm.
Jonathan Swift said we need to be reminded far more than we need to be told. And the learning process for humans is so much about the idea of repetition and returning to the thing. In spiritual development and discipleship, it's so much about that. It's going back to the same thing.
Yeah.
And you don't, for parents in this, you don't get a one and done of, like, we had the talk about social media, and that it's the willingness to continue to stay engaged in it.
I mean, you
Because
could apply
parents
that.
will, yeah.
You could apply that a principle to a lot of things, especially sexuality.
Ooh, yeah.
If you have the
S
birds and bees talk, great, but are you having follow-up conversations about all the other things that are now stirring and the
yeah.
questions that they have? Are you a safe place to discuss things that they learn from school
Mhm.
or learn from their friends?
Yeah.
And so I think that that principle applies to a lot of things, but especially sexuality and social media use and a lot of other very challenging
So
things.
many things, body image, of,
Yeah.
eating habits, take your pick.
Yeah.
And that's all of us. And I think sometimes parents have this idea that they can kind of decree something and then it's done and they don't have to revisit it again. Or if they have to revisit it again, it's because of a moral fault
Mm.
in somebody else.
Yeah.
So there's
So
not.
I think the what people may initially then feel is if I had to have ongoing conversations about these things, I have to become an expert on them. I don't have the capacity to do that. Um, and I would say to them, no, you don't have to be the expert. You just have to be a safe place to talk. You have to have curious questions about where they are.
Mhm.
And so to some level, that's a very broad statement of the what to do, but to be open, safe, and curious, I think are maybe starting steps for their guidance of how to do it.
I
But
would
then as
agree.
we go into some of the APA's guidance, what more do we want to share from there?
The big thing that they highlight is, um, to have open, ongoing discussions about
That's what I
the
said.
yeah, impact of what they're saying. Yeah, so you're aligned with the APA. Of
That's good.
thinking about tailoring
Yeah.
access to your kid based on where they are in their developmental journey and also just where they are as kids.
Yeah.
Not everything is equally tempting or equally problematic to all people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And all of us as humans deal with temptation. Not all of us deal with the same temptation.
Hmm.
I get like, for example, for games, like on, you know, particularly freemium games that, pay and you get extra coins to do this thing or things like
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
I'll do a little bit of that, but I just find it irritating in the end. And it doesn't fire off my dopamine receptors like it does other people.
Mm.
And so, for example, my wife will, for Lent, at times will give up games on her phone because it is something that can suck her in, and
Yeah.
it doesn't do that for me. And so it wouldn't be a reasonable fast for me to take because it really doesn't represent me giving up a whole lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
But understanding your kid, looking at their habits, looking at like having ways to ongoing monitor. If
Yeah.
you're using an iOS system device, so an iPhone, there are a lot of built-in things to manage screen time, to manage access to apps, to manage certain timing for apps. There are a lot of outside softwares. Custodio and Covenant Eyes are ones particularly for they were designed for a lot of things like pornography exposure, but they have the ability to engage with and set limits for other apps or
Yeah.
access to
Mhm.
things.
Yeah.
Um, what else does the APA recommend? Uh, uh, Looking at, what the exposure of things, looking at, the navigation of what, not all apps are equal. I don't spend a lot of time teaching about individual apps, partly because they change and what's kind of hip and hot,
Yeah.
becomes different so quickly. And I'd rather teach people kind of a method or a mold to think about things more holistically versus
But
what's the latest
yeah.
thing.
But I think that's as far as individual apps go, even back to the developmental stage of your child, is to consider what content would they access there, and are they ready to have full access to that type of content?
Yeah. And
Um,
not all apps are equal.
right.
And but I think a further thing, this isn't from the APA, but this is, to recognize the developmental context socially that somebody's in. I was talking to a parent fairly recently, and they were talking about their frustration with Snapchat. Because Snapchat, one of the things that it creates really bad is a lot of FOMO, the fear of missing out, because the way that app functions in streaks, it really kind of encourages immediate
Yeah.
engagement, and this idea of being away from it's problematic. But this parent was talking about if this was how like study groups for her child were doing,
Yeah.
like it wasn't over text message, it wasn't over email. They were navigating a group assignment over Snapchat.
Yeah.
And then it becomes like, well, I don't feel I can take this from my child because they need it in this way. Uh, and so it's ongoing, realizing that to really handle this, and this is for those who are in church leadership, this is my challenge to you. You have to be able to be willing to put the effort to create alternative ecosystems for this to work. It's
Uh,
really hard to do this and sustain it as an island, as a family, or as a parent in this. You can do good things. You can do some things in it. Um, but you don't get to step out of this. You don't get the excuse to say, well, they know what they need, they know better. There's so many kids that will talk about, and this came out of a lot of the APA's research. Kids saying, I'd hate this. I don't feel I can stop, or I'm also fearful of this being taken away from me. But I
yeah.
hate how it makes me feel.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm,
as we're getting close to wrapping up,
mm,
I do want to end with the scripture because that feels,
mm.
and this is Philippians 4:8 through 9. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, If there is any moral excellence and if there's anything praiseworthy, dwell on these things. Do what you have learned and received and heard from me and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you.
It's good.
These are, and to extend this further to the adults listening to this, think about your own social media use. Does it reflect things that are praiseworthy, things that are good? You may not be engaging in pornography. You may not be engaging in things that are more overt, but like, what is it? Think of your social media use. What does it do to your soul?
Yeah.
Do you come away from how you interact on social media more angry, more judgmental, less patient? More are the fruits of the spirit being manifested in how you choose to engage in things? I think of one
Yeah.
person close to me. They spend a lot of time pulling up kind of deep state conspiracy things on YouTube.
Yeah.
And my challenge to them, and go, I'm not even questioning you if is every one of these things true or untrue. Is you spend so much time doing this, what is this doing to you?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Is there a level of contentment that you come away with?
yeah. And I think that's the biggest thing. Like, do you find that what you're doing does it make you more present in your relationships? Does it make you more content in your physical being? Does it make you more content in your relationships? Does it make you more content in the level of material possessions you have? And that goes back to the immodesty connected to
Yeah.
wealth. Of we often, the world is constantly trying to present us with ways to see ourselves and to be dissatisfied, because part of the economic systems that are around us is offering us in exchange for money the solution
Mm.
to your feeling of discontent.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah.
That's what I got on this, Matt.
Well, so my final thought would be that as I was reflecting on my own journey earlier, I did have to remove it to allow space for these things that we're talking about for me to reflect on this passage. Um, and I may never come back to it, but I may come back to it in the future. And so I don't want to say that this is totally removed, but I think for all of us to assess how is its impact in my life, is it producing the things that are on the scripture? And then more so, if I have any influence over adolescents, whether they're my child, I'm a youth worker, a teacher, a pastor, a counselor, how do I speak into this to help them understand how to navigate it? So that's the beginning of this conversation for everyone as we talk about it. We'll have more conversation as it relates to social media as we move forward, but we appreciate the time that you've given us to talk to you about it today.
Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely.
we will look forward to talking to you again. And until next time, farewell.
Later.
Thank you again for being a part of our latest episode of Church Psychology. If you have enjoyed it, we hope that you will share this episode with others in your life. And please do remember to follow, like, and/or subscribe to Church Psychology wherever you're finding us, and leave us a review. We look forward to connecting with you again soon.